Once again, welcome, Mark. Thank you very much for joining our lectures. I have distinct honor to welcome you and all our listeners for this. I'm sure it would be a wonderful presentation. Just about now, I had to pack my suits and travel toward the Middle East, but alas, Lord had different plans for this year and everything has been altered. But nevertheless, it's my great joy to see you and to hear your voice again and to hear your wonderful presentation again. And Mark is my dear friend of many years and a great lover of biblical and church and Byzantine history, and great expert on Christian sites all over Asia Minor and Istanbul, Constantinople in particular. So I'm just passing the microphone and presentation to you. I'll be here, obviously, but I'll put myself on mute as not to interrupt any presentation. If you do have any questions, please send them via private format or in a group chat. But first, let Mark do the presentation, and then we'll have some time with him where he'll be able to answer to your questions, which I'm sure you're going to have. Okay, so welcome, Mark. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that great introduction. So, yeah, tonight or today, it's tonight for me, 8 p.m., middle of the day for those who are stateside. We're going to delve into the Istanbul Archaeology Museum and see several items from the Bible, especially from the Old Testament. Obviously, this is not going to be a all-inclusive type of visit. There's many items that we can speak of, but I've picked some items that I think are very interesting, at least for me. So I'm going to share primarily on those objects and items. But before we do so, I just want to give a brief introduction on the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. Really, this museum, the reason it's here is because of Osman Hamdi Bey. Osman Hamdi Bey was an Ottoman administrator and intellectual, an art expert, and in 1881 he was appointed as the director of the Imperial Museum, and he's the one that rewrote the Antiquities laws to create a nationally sponsored archaeological expeditions, especially to the Middle East. He's known for several expeditions, primarily his expeditions in Sidon, which he came up with the Alexander sarcophagus. It's a very famous sarcophagus that's hosted in the museum. And he's also kind of a Renaissance man. So this is a famous painting by him, the tortoise trainer, that you can see. The museum itself consists of three different buildings. There's the main building that you see at the top right. But then there's two more buildings, the Museum of the Ancient Orient in the bottom left, and the tiled kiosk in the bottom right. So most of the items we're going to see, they're hosted in the third floor of the main building where the Syro-Palestine collection is located, and also in the Ancient Orient building where a lot of the Babylonian, Assyrian, Sumerian objects and items are located. The tiled kiosk, it's mostly tiles from Kütahya and İznik from Ottoman times, so it's a really beautiful collection in its own merit, but it doesn't have to do anything with sort of our theme today. Speaking of İznik, on a side note, if you've ever visited İznik or Nicaea, they've also found Byzantine tiles there. In fact, if you're driving from Istanbul and you pass the Istanbul Gate in the ancient city, to your first right, you'll see a shop. And they do a lot of tiles there, including Byzantine tiles. They found several Byzantine tiles in the excavations and they recreate them using the old techniques, most of which used colors like red, yellow, etc., etc. So just keep that in mind if you're interested with Byzantine tiles as well, that there's a shop in Nicaea that actually recreates them based on the excavations. I know Father Ilya would be definitely interested. So here's a little summary of what we're going to see today. Basically, what I've done is I've divided the items that we're going to see based on the period, so to speak, or at least where in the Bible or where we find them in the Bible, or at least what section of the Bible they're connected with. So we're going to first look at the Pentateuch, the items that you see here in blue, Akpalu and the Tree of Life. Obviously, I'm going to be presenting these individually. Guria Vlagosh, ancient Near Eastern law codes, mummy of Egyptian priest. Then we're going to go to the monarchy period. I'm going to speak of Baal Haddad stela, the storm god. Many of you know Baal, mentioned in the Bible. It's quite famous. Astarte, or Ashtoret, or Asherah, another famous Canaanite goddess. We have a censor that belongs to her. Adat Nirari III inscription, possibly, it's my theory, he might be the king involved in the Noah story. We're going to see an inscription from Sennacherib, the Gezer calendar, which is one of the oldest Hebrew scripts to date, the Siloam inscription, and the Samaria ostraca, and the royal handles. Then we're going to go to the exile period, and we're going to see some reliefs from the Ishtar Gate, a statue of a Lamassu, which is like a cherub in the Bible, the Nabonidus stela, Belshazzar's father. Then we're going to look at some objects that have some parallels with wisdom, literature, and poetry that we find in the Bible. So we're going to look at a Sumerian Proverbs book, the oldest love poem, which has some parallels with the Song of Songs. We're going to look at the plague prayer of Mursilius II, the Hittite king. And then we're going to switch to the New Testament with the Jerusalem temple inscriptions, the bust of Augustus and Tiberius, and altars to nameless gods. That will be the end of our collection for today. Obviously, there's much more to see, but for time constraints, I had to limit the items that we're going to be able to review together. A lot of people, when I tour the museum, they're actually surprised that so many objects and items are found here. Like, how on earth did it make it to Istanbul? You got to remember that when the great excavations started especially the 19th century, the Brits and the Germans and many other folks that went to the Middle East, all these Middle Eastern territories belonged to the Ottoman Empire. And actually they had to have permission from the Ottomans. And they did have agreements. So usually these agreements were that 1/3 of what was found was to be taken back by the archaeologists, 1/3 was to be donated to the Istanbul Museum, and 1/3 was to be displayed in location. Obviously, these accords or these agreements weren't respected. So you have a lot of stories, like the famous stories of, Schliemann smuggling treasures from Troy, or the Elgin marbles also smuggled from the Parthenon. They were taken to the British Museum, so on and so forth. So that's why we have a lot of items here. And so for me, this museum is very important. It's right up there with the British Museum and the Berlin Museum, the Pergamon Museum, and the Israel Museum in Jerusalem in terms of both quantity and quality of the material that is found. But without further ado, let's start with some interesting engravings here. Akpalu and the Tree of Life. These are from Ashurbanipal II's palace in Nineveh. Two of these are from the southwestern palace, and one of them is from the northwestern palace. These are basically genies. It's what the word Akpalu is. It's from 883 to 859 BC. The function of such imagery is largely unknown. There are several theories as to what the tree may mean, that they are flanking. So basically, what you have here is the genies would be flanking a tree of life, and you see a tree of life detail in another of the genies. And they would be getting some sort of seeds with pine cones. It's so said. We don't really know. Some consider it a symbolic depiction of a date palm, as one of the important sources of food and nourishment in ancient Mesopotamia. Others make the connection with the Edenic tree of life, others with a fertility ritual. In earlier Sumerian mythology, the sacred tree is connected with the goddess Inanna. So there are several myths as well connected with the Sumerian fertility goddess. In one of them, Inanna finds a tree, and Gilgamesh cuts the tree down and makes a throne for Inanna. In another of the myths, she goes to the underworld where she eats from a tree, and Basically, she has a sexual encounter, so she loses her innocence with the tree. So there's some connections with the rite of Inanna as well. Obviously, it would be too exaggerated to, how should I say, draw a parallelism with the biblical tree of life. However, it is possible, and this is my thought. It's a theory I have. You'll hear me repeat this again when we see the Astarte Sensor as well. It might be that the tree of life inclusion in the Garden of Eden, or at least in the Genesis account by Moses, might be polemical in nature as well. So Inanna as being a source of life because she's a fertility goddess versus Yahweh being a source of life. And so that might be one of the reasons why the tree of life imagery is used as well. The sacred tree is reminiscent of the tree of life in the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were created to be in intimate relationship with God, but instead of feeding from the tree of life, they chose to feed from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. In other words, they had the possibility of living eternally in an intimate relationship with God, being fed by Him. However, they chose a life of self-dependency in which they would be their own gods, in which they would be their own moral compasses. In the Old Testament, the tree of life imagery is also used for wisdom, especially in Proverbs 3, verses 18 through 20. It says that wisdom is a tree of life to those who lay hold of her. Those who hold her fast are called blessed. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding He established the heavens. By His knowledge the deeps broke open, and the clouds dropped down the dew. In the New Testament, John makes a connection between a tree of life and Jesus. In John 15, Jesus compares Himself to a vine. Those that abide with Him and feed from His life produce life and much fruit. Those that don't are cast away. In John 6, Jesus states that those who feed and drink of Him will have eternal life. And the book of Revelation seems to be making a tree of life symbolism in conjunction with Christ as well. The New Jerusalem is depicted with the tree of life in the midst in Revelation 22. This tree produces 12 types of fruit and leaves that heal the nations. 12 in other places is used as a symbolic number designated for God's people. The corpus of the New Testament seems to be making the connection that eternal life is to be found in Christ, and that those who tap and abide in His source will enjoy the benefits of life eternal. So again, those two trees in the Garden of Eden, one being the deception of Satan and one being the source of life, the relationship with God Himself. So again, the tree of life being used perhaps for polemical purposes in the Old Testament. Another interesting detail is the cherubim and the chariot wheels in one of these Akpalu. I will go into the role of the cherubim later, but this is sort of reminiscent of Ezekiel's vision, where he sees the chariot wheels and the cherubim surrounding the throne. These are motifs that are repeated a lot in antiquity, especially in important buildings and thrones. Usually the thrones of ancient kings used to have cherubs or lions on each side, and some thrones were of a movable type with wheels. So it seems that Ezekiel is seeing God in His glory and His kingly throne there as well. So again, very interesting details from Ashurbanipal's palace in Nineveh. Next in line is someone that I find very interesting and fascinating, Guria Vlagosh. These items date from the 22nd century BCE. They were found in Girsu, modern-day Iraq. Gudea was the king of the Sumerian city-state of Lagash. After 200 years of servitude to Akkadian overlords, the Sumerians gained a measure of freedom when northern tribes called the Gutians started raiding the Akkadians. And it's in this window of opportunity that Gudea ruled. And this period is also known as the Sumerian Renaissance for the high quality and number of artwork that has been found. Gudea was known to be a shepherd king. The shepherd king was often used by Sumerian rulers as a way to distinguish themselves from neighboring cultures. In Egypt, for example, the king was regarded as a god, and such kings would overlord over their subjects. In Sumer, however, kings tend to be depict themselves as servants of the people. Shepherds tend to flock and protect them from predators. As such, the rulers in Sumer saw themselves as herders of men. The ruler would take care of his subjects and protect them. In return, the subjects would willingly give their allegiance to their ruler. Gudea, however, took this concept a step further, and he refused the title of king, which in Sumerian is lugal, and instead adopted the title of NC, or governor. The NC was subservient to the lugal. Given that Gudea was the highest man in power, some believe that he chose the title NC because he saw himself not as a king, but as a servant of the god Ningirsu, a god of law, farming, hunting, and war. Many inscriptions have been discovered where Gudea details construction projects, including numerous temples to his deity. Gudea was concerned for issues of social justice, the social welfare of his people, both in his steles and his statues that have remained. It's interesting that Gudea resembles more of a priest than he does a king. Maybe not in this statue, but there's another one in the Louvre where he has a headband. And usually those headbands were not worn by kings, but were worn by priests. So you have this figure who, despite being a king, he's rejecting the title king, giving this title to the god that he worships, which is Ningirsu, and instead opting for the title of governor or priest. There's a debate as to what these titles exactly mean. Some people say that lugal perhaps is not the title for the king of a city-state, but perhaps for the king that is overseeing various city-states. So again, it's open to discussion and open to interpretation, but what we see here is a votive dedication to Ningirsu and also a sacred basin dedicated to Ningirsu. And you can see these maidens that are holding these pots with flowing water. This water supposedly coming from Ningirsu himself. He is giving him life. As for what the sacred basin was used for, we don't know. Perhaps some sort of ritual purification, it could be. So this is very interesting because I see a lot of parallels between Gudea and the figure of Melchizedek in Genesis. We see in Gudea how the role of the high priest and the king was merged into one. We also know that during this period, Gudea had an active trade life with the Mediterranean coast, especially Syria, Lebanon, and Israel. Much of the cedar wood and stone used in his construction projects were brought from this area. So for me, there are some unavoidable similarities in play between the biblical figure of Melchizedek and Gudea. Melchizedek seems to reflect the philosophy of Sumerian rulership, much like in Gudea. In Melchizedek, we see the fusion between the roles of the king and the high priest who rules for the welfare and the peace of his people. The name Melchizedek itself means king of righteousness or king of justice. Perhaps Melchizedek saw himself as an NC of El Elyon, or as a servant of the Most High God. At the very least, that's what we understand from Genesis 14. It says he was the priest of the Most High God. I don't think it would be too far-fetched to suggest some bridges between ancient Sumer and Melchizedek's Salem or Jerusalem. The name of the city Jerusalem suggests Sumerian connections. Uru Salim is the form in which the city name appears in the Amarnat letters in 1330 BCE. Some have suggested the etymological origin of Ur-Shalim would be a composite of the Sumerian word for city, Ur, and the Ugaritic word for the god of dusk, Shalim. Dusk is the time of day when the day draws to completion. Perhaps this is the root of the concept of peace, shalom. Biblically speaking, a connection between Canaan and Sumer is also not too far-fetched. Abraham and his family migrated from Ur to Canaan. It's possible that there was some affinity between Abraham and Melchizedek, king of Ur-Shalim. This would perhaps explain Melchizedek's willingness to assist Abraham's men after they rescued Lot in a conflict with local Canaanite rulers. Following the rescue of Lot, Melchizedek offered bread and wine to Abraham's men and blessed them with a prayer. Abraham thanked Melchizedek for his assistance by giving him a tenth of the loot he had obtained in Lot's rescue mission. Both Melchizedek and Abraham seem to have grasped the idea that there was one creator God. Both understood that they were serving him. In Psalm 110, David recognizes the coming Messiah would be a priest in the order of Melchizedek. In other words, the Messiah would fulfill both the role of king and high priest. And we see especially the writer of the Hebrews uses that typology as well for Jesus. So in Jesus Christ, we have the perfect fulfillment of the idealized Sumerian vision of the shepherd king that Gudea and other Sumerian kings sought to achieve in their lifetime. Jesus is the perfect high priest and king who does not brutally lord over his subjects, but works on behalf of their welfare. He is a king who gains the loyalty and allegiance of his subjects, not through force or terror, but through his grace. So again, a lot of parallels between Gudea and Melchizedek, this priest king from the Sumerian city of Lagash. Next, I want to show you a series of law codes. We're going to have three that I want to show you. The first is the law code of Ur-Nammu. The next is the law code of Hammurabi. And finally, some Hittite laws as well. But starting from the code of Ur-Nammu, you know, most people say that, or most people tend to believe that Hammurabi's code is the oldest law code known to man, which is not precisely true, because the code of Ur-Nammu is almost 300 years older than the code of Hammurabi. So it's considered the oldest legal code or legal text to be discovered. Perhaps it served as a source material for some of Hammurabi too. Ur-Nammu was the king of the city-state of Ur, and he was known for his many construction projects, most famous of which is the ziggurat of the city of Ur. The tablet in question is partially damaged, therefore only the prologue and a selection of the laws can be distinguished. Much like in the Code of Hammurabi, Ur-Nammu stresses the mandate he received from the god Utu in his mission to codify the laws. His regard for the widow and the orphan is evident. He says, "I did not deliver the orphan to the rich. I did not deliver the widow to the mighty." This shares some similarities with the Old Testament text. "You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child," found in Exodus 22:22. I want to read a short prologue, and then after that, just compare and contrast some of the codes between Ur-Nammu and Moses. So the prologue starts the following way. Ur-Nammu, the mighty warrior, king of the city of Ur, king of the lands of Sumer and Akkad, he established 21,600 silas of barley, 30 sheep, 30 silas of butter per month as regular offerings in the land. When the gods An and Enlil turned over the kingship of the city of Ur to the god Nana, at that time, for Ur-Nammu, son born of the goddess Ninsun, for her beloved house-born slave, according to the god Nana's justice and truth, gave to him ... I promoted Namhani to be governor of the city of Lagash. By the mighty god Nana, my lord, I returned Nana's Magam boat to the quay and made it shine in the city of Ur. And the prologue keeps going on, but I'm going to skip. It's quite a long prologue. But I wrote the whole thing down for later. If you guys are interested, I can share it with you. But looking at the codes themselves, you're going to notice some interesting things. For example, according to code number 2, if a man commits robbery, he will be killed. Now contrast that with the law of Moses that basically says if somebody steals a sheep or an ox, he must repay 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. So there's no death penalty for robbery in this case. Code number 3, if a man commits a kidnapping, he is to be imprisoned and pay 15 shekels of silver. Now this contrasts quite a bit with the Mosaic Code about kidnapping, because they have to be put to death according to the Mosaic Code. Code number 7, if the wife of a man followed after another man and slept with her, they shall slay the woman, but that male shall be set free. Again, big contrast here with adultery cases in the Old Testament, where both men and women are killed, or inflicted capital punishment. Code number 8, if a man proceeded by force and deflowered the virgin female slave of another man, that man must pay 5 shekels of silver. So this is the deflowering of a virgin against her own wish, against her own will. Whoever does this must pay 5 shekels of silver. Contrast this with Deuteronomy 22, which speaks of 50 shekels of silver, so 10 times more, and also has a stipulation as to the fact that that woman will be married to that man. Now, to us, it might sound as a little bit barbaric, but the object of this stipulation was to protect the woman, or at least to provide for her for the rest of her lifetime. And obviously, this was in case that the woman's father was okay with it. Another code, if a man accused the wife of a man of adultery and the river ordeal proved her innocent, then the man who had accused her must pay 1/3 of a mina of silver. Again, very different from the code in Deuteronomy. And as far as the witnesses in the court, if a man appeared as a witness and was shown to be a perjurer, he must pay 15 shekels of silver. Contrast that with the death penalty for false witness, false testimony. So Again, there's some very, very obvious contrasts here. Several observations can be made. The Urnamo Code tends to punish crimes committed against human dignity, like kidnapping and perjury, with fines, while crimes against property, like robbery, are punished with death. In the Mosaic Law, we observe an opposite approach. Sins against life and human dignity are punished by death, while property crimes are converted into fines. Secondly, the differences in the treatment of women is quite apparent. In the Urnamo Code, a woman committing adultery is subjected to capital punishment, while the man is set free. In contrast, in the Mosaic Law, both men and women convicted of adultery are subject to capital punishment. In the Urnamo Code, the penalty given to a man who abuses a virgin is 5 shekels of silver. In the Mosaic Code, it's 10 times harsher. So you can see that there's opposite worldviews, and the reason why there's opposite worldviews is primarily because of the imago Dei, the principle found in the Old Testament that man is created in the image of God. So crimes that are against human dignity and human life are treated with the death penalty, whereas in these Mesopotamian codes, they're treated with fines. So you see a very opposite worldview in play here. The next law code that I want to speak about is the Code of Hammurabi. Very famous. There's a well-known stone inscription in the Louvre Museum of the Hammurabi Code, and more than 30 copies of the Code of Hammurabi have been discovered and exist to this day. This is just one of these clay versions. The code begins with a prologue containing lavish praises towards Hammurabi, who has received authority and a divine mandate from the god Shamash, the Mesopotamian god of justice, morality, and truth, to come up with a legal code. The code consists of 12 divisions. First, he speaks of the principles of the legal process, then burglary, then vassalage, then immovables, then trader and agents, then taverns, deposits, family codes, codes concerning wounding, building of house and ships, hiring, and slaves. The code concludes with an epilogue praising Hammurabi and encourages his successors to continue applying these laws. By far the most famous of these laws are Article 196 and 197, which state, if a man put out an eye of another man, his eye shall be put out. If he break another man's bone, his bone shall be broken, which a lot of people compare with Exodus 21:24, which says eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, and foot for foot. Such similarities in the past prompted scholars to argue for the dependency of the Mosaic Code on Hammurabi's Code. And those similarities do exist. There are plenty of divergences and differences that discredit such dependency claims. The measures of eye for an eye was meant to provide for just restitution and curb blood feuds and vendettas, which ended up causing social disorder and more evil than good. A contextual clue as why Sarah might have suggested Abraham to lie with Hagar for an heir in Genesis 16 is found in this code. The Code of Hammurabi makes provisions for such cases, suggesting that this was a common practice during the times of the patriarchs. Article 146, if a man takes a wife and she give this man a maidservant as wife, and she bear him children, and then this maid assume equality with the wife because she has borne him children, her master shall not sell her for money, but he may keep her as a slave, reckoning her among the maidservants. If his wife bear sons to a man, or if his maidservant have borne sons, and the father, while still living, says to the children whom his maidservant has borne, my sons, and he count them with the sons of his wife, if then the father die, then the sons of the wife and of the maidservant shall divide the paternal property in common. The son of the wife is to partition and choose. Article 170. So here we have a code that's saying that even though the son may be born from another woman, he has to split the inheritance, or the biological son from the wife has to split the inheritance with the son from the maidservant. So this might be coming into play as well as Sarah is making her choice. I mean, she has a personal feud already with Hagar, but perhaps the idea of also splitting the inheritance she doesn't like very much. So this might be coming into play as well. So again, these are very interesting codes. You can see a lot of similarities and parallelisms. In some cases, they're very similar. In some cases, they're a little different, as you can see from the screen. Next in line is the Hittite laws. These cuneiform tablets are from the 16th to 13th century BCE. They were discovered in Hattusha, the capital of the Hittite kingdom. They're exhibited in the Troya, just opposite the Troya 6 showcase. So this is the second floor of the main museum building. BO 294 and BO 297. BO 294 happens to be the oldest example we have of Hittite laws, dating from the 16th century, and is especially fascinating as we compare it with the restitution laws contained in the Mosaic Law Code. BO 294 2094 contains several revisions and amendments, and this change is evident from the repeated usage of the words formerly and now. This indicates that there was an even older code in existence. One of the most interesting aspects of this collection is that we can compare these laws with an even more recent one, BO 297, a collection that dates from the 13th century. And upon comparing parallel laws, one can notice an interesting progression. Although not in all cases, with the passage of time, punishments for crimes against free men tend to get harsher, and punishments for crimes against slaves tend to get lighter. Again, so there was an older law code. We know this especially from the language used in BO 2094, because it says formerly it was like this, now it's going to be like this. And then we have another law code from the 13th century. So you see an interesting progression. It's as if punishment against slaves is getting harsher. For crimes against slaves is getting lighter, and punishment against crimes against free men is getting harsher. So you can see an interesting progression here. Similar laws of restitution, as you can see on the screen, appear in Exodus 21, 18 through 19, and also verses 26 to 27. It says, when men quarrel and one strikes the other with a stone or with his fist, and the man does not die but takes to his bed, and if the man rises again and walks outdoors with his staff, he who struck him shall be cleared. Only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. Verses 26 to 27. When a man strikes the eye of a slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. As is the case with any written document or legal of legal nature, a worldview is what determines the values and order of a society. Such values are consequently reflected on the legal code, and the comparison between ancient Near Eastern law codes with the Old Testament in many cases highlight the uniqueness of the Mosaic Law. So several differences exist. Mesopotamian law codes are initiated by rulers who receive a mandate from God. The Mosaic Code claims direct revelation. The primary objective of the Mesopotamian law codes is to establish social order in a way that creates boundaries between social classes. Quite often, punishment for crimes depends on social rank. The Mosaic Code takes as its basis the holiness of God. As such, the degree of punishments is based more on the nature of the crime. The Mosaic Law is also interested in religious purity and emphasizes the inherent value of human life. Mesopotamian laws tend to be more lenient with crimes against human life and dignity, but harsher with crimes dealing with theft or property. So again, big contrast to highlight here, especially to those that suggest some sort of dependency of the Mosaic laws to these ancient Near Eastern laws. We see quite a big contrast in play. Next in line, we have a mummy of an Egyptian priest from the New Kingdom period. We have a few interesting items here. The canopic jars, which held the vital organs during the mummification process. As you know, the organs were taken out. This priest mummy is interesting. As you can see, there's another little mummified body within the coffin. That's the cat of the priest. So it's very interesting because you don't see this often in mummy displays. And also here is a box with figurines. These are the ushapti, or statuettes of maidens or helpers that are meant to aid the priest in the afterlife and serve him. As you know, in the book of Exodus, we read that God called the people out of Egypt, and he gave them a calling to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The word priest comes loaded with different meanings nowadays, but one question for me is, what did it mean to be a priest during the time of Moses? So I just want to briefly explain what it was like in ancient Egypt to live like a priest. Many types of priests existed in ancient Egypt. The high priests were chosen by the pharaoh. They were considered the mediators between the people and their gods. It was a position that had political as well as religious authority. Just below the high priest was the lector priest, known as the Cherubim. They would write and copy religious texts and instruct clergy as well, and give authoritative utterances and celebrations. The hour priests were astronomers who kept the calendar, studied astrology, and interpreted dreams. The sem priests were the embalmers who mummified corpses and recited the incantations that would guarantee eternal life to the deceased. And then we also have the wa priests, who were responsible for the purifications of vessels and instruments used in ceremony. So we see a lot of different classes of priests here in this play. Besides the high priest, most priestly positions in Egypt were part-time duties. So most priests also had a lay life. While they were in service, priests were meant to live a holy life, that is, a life set apart for the God they were serving. They had to ritually purify themselves from the mundane, and as such, they had to observe several purity laws, like circumcision. They needed to bathe a number of times a day. They had to be completely shaven, including eyebrows and eyelashes, and they could only wear linen, and they were prohibited from eating certain kinds of food, especially fish. We don't know why, perhaps because it smelled bad. Purity laws were a sign and testimony for the beholder that the person in question was no ordinary person, but a priest dedicated to the service of the deity. As you know, the term holiness in Hebrew is kadosh. Holiness does not necessarily convey sinlessness or moral perfection, but holiness is a type of consecration of something, or someone meant to be used for a divine purpose. It is that which leaves its worldly use and is set apart for a divine transcendental use. Many objects in the tent of the tabernacle were considered holy, not because of any inherent moral value, but because they were consecrated and set apart for special use through the sacrificial blood of a lamb, the sprinkling of the blood. Likewise, priests were made holy not because of their inner righteousness or moral qualities, but because they were dedicated to service through the blood of a sacrificial lamb. The holy life was not the responsibility of only the priestly class in ancient Israel. All the people had the responsibility to live a life set apart. This meant that all Israelites had the responsibility to live a life of consecration, a life that reflected the values of Yahweh. So this included several purity laws, several dietary laws, etc. Why? Because in this way, the Israelites would be set apart from the Canaanites, and the God that they worshipped and the God that they served would be obvious for everybody to see. Now, it's interesting that some of the dietary laws and in the Old Testament, although we don't know for sure, might be related due to some religious purposes or purposes to distinguish themselves from the Canaanites. For example, according to Canaanite mythology, El, the king of the pantheon, would eat goat meat boiled in milk in order to increase his virility. After he would eat this meal, he would have an orgy, and according to the mythology, this is how many of his children were born. Canaanites would react these scenes in their rituals. It would be unthinkable for Israelites to claim they served Yahweh while participating in a similar meal. As you know, in Exodus 23:19, it says that you will not eat the meat boiled in his mother's milk. So is this the root of some of these kosher laws, dietary laws? Perhaps. It makes a tantalizing proposition for me. It's very possible that many Canaanites reenacted these mythological stories. There's another story where Anat, she's the goddess of war, She's known to drink blood when she kills her opponents or before she kills her opponents. So perhaps the Canaanites also would have a blood drinking ritual before or after they went to war, and maybe that's why some of the prohibitions of consuming blood. Perhaps, again, I'm not 100% positive, but it makes sense to me, at least as a proposition. Next up, we're going to switch gears, and we're done with sort of the Pentateuch period, and we're going to move into the period of the monarchy. And I'm going to start with the figure of Baal Haddad. There are two images that could be attributed to Baal in the Istanbul museums. The first is a basalt stela retrieved from Babylon that is displayed in the ancient Orient building. It dates from 9th century BC. The stele depicts Teshub, or the Hittite version of Baal Haddad. As you can see, he's a god of the storm. He's holding these thunderbolts in his hands. It's thought to have been produced in Aleppo and brought to Babylon as a spoil of war. Currently, it is in the display of the ancient Orient section. The second figure is of an unidentified god with a gold-leafed hat and skirt. But I think this is also Baal Haddad, especially because it resembles another figurine that's in display in Paris in the Louvre Museum. Again, you can see this figure is raising his hand to perhaps hold a hammer, just like Baal Haddad would, or the storm god would. It is, in fact, of my opinion, that this is a Canaanite depiction of the same god, and this figurine is located on the third floor of the main museum building. As you know, Baal is one of the Canaanite gods that is most mentioned in the Bible. One of the most important myths of the fertility cults of Canaan was the so-called Baal cycle. The Baal cycle explains the rise of Baal as one of the chief gods of the pantheon. Similar to how Zeus ousted Kronos as chief among the gods, the Baal cycle explains Baal's rise to prominence and the popularity among the Canaanites. It was also a way of explaining the seasonal cycles. In the myth, Baal is slain by Mot, who's the god of death, and is considered to be dead until he miraculously comes back to life through the aid of Anat. This myth served to explain the seasons of drought and provide ritualistic practices to encourage the rebirth of Baal so that the rains would return and a fertile cycle would begin. I'm going to skip the story of the Baal cycle, but you can find it online. There's several resources that you can find online about the myth itself and how Baal defeated Yam and then fights against Mot and then is killed and then comes back to life with the help of her sister and consort Anat, etc., etc. It's interesting that this myth is perhaps the reason for the laceration of the prophets of Baal upon their confrontation with Elijah in Mount Carmel. The lacerations may have been a way of acting out the myth in order to encourage Baal to come out of hiding. Given Baal's sexual relationships with Anat, I wouldn't be too surprised that some of the cultic activities may also have included bestiality, perhaps relations with heifers, because Anat takes the body of a heifer and has a sexual relationship with Baal in the myth. And this would be a mythological acting out of the drama, but also a way of ensuring that the blessing of these gods would flow into the people. The name Baal appears approximately 90 times in the scriptures. However, given that the name Baal also came to be used as a generic title meaning Lord, not all references are specific to the storm god. Some references are to the regional deities that made the use of the word Lord. For example, Baal Berit in Judges 8:3. One of the reasons why Baal worship was prominent in Israel is because the Hebrews were by and large an agrarian society. So this makes a lot of sense. If you're living off the land and you're having periods of drought and you're praying, let's say, to Yahweh, but no answer seems to come, what's the next best option? Well, there's a storm god called Baal, so pray to Baal, try your chances, and maybe you'll get rain. So this might be one of the reasons why Baal was so popular amongst the Jews. It's not until the time of the kings that we begin to see the rise of polemical literature as the worship of Yahweh began to gain ground again. Some scholars believe that Psalm 29 and Psalm 82 are both to be read as polemical poetry. Both psalms stress Yahweh's superiority among the gods. Psalm 29 specifically seems to be using imagery that would be traditionally associated with Baal. It says, "Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name, worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. The voice of the Lord is over the waters, the God of glory thunders, the Lord over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful, the voice of the Lord is full of majesty. The voice of the Lord breaks the cedars, the Lord breaks the cedars of Lebanon." So this connection with water, the voice of the storms, Yahweh riding on the clouds of heaven, an imagery that is interestingly used of Baal primarily until this sort of polemical literature comes across, or that we see in the Psalms. Notice also that the Son of Man in Daniel 7 is also said to be riding the clouds of heaven. So again, this is again polemical language being used. The biblical authors are taking metaphors that were used of Baal and applying them to Yahweh. So this is what I just said. Next slide. Okay, here's an interesting, very interesting item. It's an Astarte Sensor. In the third floor of the main museum building, we encounter a series of objects connected with Astarte. Among these are several figurines and a terracotta censer. The figure of Astarte is a complicated one. It most likely is an Iron Age amalgamation of the Canaanites goddesses Asherah and Anat. It's probably an import from the goddess Ishtar from Mesopotamia, but it's also a sort of a combination of the pre-Canaanite gods Asherah and Anat. So it's sort of a mixed figure here. Ugaritic and other Canaanite materials associate Asherah with several symbols like lions indicating power, serpents representing healing, and sacred trees, perhaps pointing to life and longevity. And if you look at the bottom of the censer, you see a sacred tree, and also you have these lions and other beasts that are on the edges. In the Istanbul Museum, the censer has traces of smoke in its inner section. That's why we know it was used for incense. There's a lot of interesting imagery. The fact that the tree of life is associated with Asherah leads some scholars to believe that the usage of this imagery in scripture might be polemical in nature, like I said before. In other words, a way for biblical authors to make the point that Yahweh and not Asherah is the source of life and the true healer of man. Another interesting point of this censer is that it has been damaged by sling stones. So who would damage this Asherah censer with sling stones? Nobody knows. Most likely a group that was against the worship of Asherah. Could it be the Israelites? Perhaps. It's difficult to say for certain, but it does make for a tantalizing proposition. While the worship of Baal concentrated on high places, the worship of Asherah seems to have been focused primarily, though not exclusively, in groves and forests as a mother goddess figure. These would have been the ideal settings for her worship. So again, the word Asherah or Asherim appears 40 times in the Bible. It's thought to refer to both the sacred wooden pole representing the goddess Asherah, like in Judges 6, and the goddess Asherah herself, like in 2 Kings 13. It's not always possible to determine whether a particular scripture is to be understood as referring to the idolatrous object or to the goddess herself. Regardless, the Israelites were commanded to cut them down and to burn them. And the Hebrews were instructed very clearly, you shall not plant any tree as an Asherah beside the altar of the Lord your God. Deuteronomy 16:21. Many scholars believe that Jeremiah's mention of the Queen of Heaven is none other than Asherah herself, as the wife of El and the mother of Baal and the Elohim or the gods. This would make sense. I find this suggestion very reasonable. In Jeremiah, we learn that the people offered baked bread and drink offerings in exchange for Asherah's influence in their lives. You can read this especially in Jeremiah chapter 7. One of the fascinating archaeological traces of this period of syncretism is to be found in Untitled Chapter. Kuntilet Arjud is located on a hill that lies 50 kilometers south of Kadesh Barnea. This site was excavated in 1975 by Tel Aviv University archaeologist Ze'ev Mashel. Several pottery shards were found with inscriptions and paintings, and the paintings depicted several animals, and actually censers were also found here. Scholars interpret what the inscriptions may mean. The inscriptions that were found concerned Yahweh of Samaria and his Asherah. So it means that the Israelites accepted Asherah as a consort of Yahweh. Now it's disputed whether this was always the case or this was the case later on. If you're a minimalist, you're going to tend to argue that this was the case all the way along, and eventually Jewish belief evolved into monotheism. If you're a maximalist, and you'll say, well, this just sort of reflects the period where Israel had left Yahweh, they were being unfaithful to the covenant, and they were worshiping all these other gods. But it's interesting that in the Iron Age, you find many inscriptions and mentions of Yahweh being worshipped together with Asherah as his consort. Another interesting inscription, this time is from Saba, dates from 810 to 783 BCE, is from the Assyrian king Adad-nirari III. Now, what makes this inscription interesting is it's the first mention of Palestine in any sort of ancient documents. The word Palashtu appears in this introductory clause. And we also know from this inscription that he was fighting against the Arameans. So the introduction reads as follows. In my 5th year of reign, when I took my seat on the royal throne in might, I mobilized the forces of my land. The widespreading armies of Assyria, I gave the order to advance against Palashtu. I crossed the Euphrates at its flood. The widespreading hostile kings who in the time of Shamshi-Adad, my father, had rebelled and withheld their tribute. At the command of the gods, Ashur-Sin, Shamash-Adad, and Ishtar, my allies, overwhelmed them, and they laid hold of my feet, and I received tribute. I gave the command to march against Aram, to Mari in Damascus. I received 100 talents of gold and 1,000 talents of silver, 1,000 talents of silver talents. So what makes this inscription very interesting for me, and again, this is a theory. I might be completely wrong about this, but I am of the opinion that this might be the king in the Jonah story. And the reason why I say this is because we have a mention in 2 Kings 13, verses 4 and 5. In the reign of Jehoahaz asked for the Lord's mercy, and the Lord responded favorably, for he saw that Israel was oppressed by the king of Syria. These are the Arameans or the Syrians. The Lord provided a deliverer for Israel, and they were freed from Syria's power. The Israelites once more lived in security. So who is this unnamed deliverer? Well, if you look at the timeline, it seems like this deliverer is none other than Adad-nirari III, who attacked Syria or Aram, and therefore Israel was once again secure. Now, 2 Kings 14 tells us that Jonah lived during the reign of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel. William Albright dates his reign to 786 to 746 BC. Thiele suggests that he was co-regent with Jehoash between 793 and 782 BC, and sole ruler between 782 and 753 BC. Now, what's interesting is that both of these dates fall within the reign of Adad-nirari III. That's why I'm suggesting that perhaps he is the one in the Jonah story. And what makes this claim or this theory even more interesting is because of the next find. So this is Francis D. Nicole. He wrote the Seventh-day Adventist Bible commentary. And in it, he mentions this. A strange religious revolution took place in the time of Adad-nirari III, which can be compared with that of the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten. For an unknown reason, Nabu, the god of Borsippa, seems to have been proclaimed sole god, or at least the principal god of the temple. A Nabu temple was erected in 787 BC at Kala, and on a Nabu statue on one of the governors dedicated to the king appeared the significant words, "Trust in Nabu, do not trust in any other god." And where does this come from? You can find it in Blukenbill's Ancient Records of Assyria and Babylonia, Volume 1, page 264. This is the statue in question. It's found in the British Museum. And in the inscription, it says the following: "O man, who shall come after me? On Nabu wait, do not trust in any other god." So it's interesting then that both the dates seem to match, and also this maybe short-lived monotheistic period seem to suggest some sort of influence from another monotheistic culture. Again, it's impossible to prove 100%, but it certainly makes for a possibility, which I find very appealing. So again, this is my theory that perhaps this king is the king of the Noah story. The next inscription I want to share with you is the Sennacherib inscription, also a very famous inscription in the museum. As you know, Sennacherib is the Assyrian king who sieged the city of Jerusalem, and it was during the reign of Hezekiah. He destroyed the city of Lachish, then sieged Jerusalem. Hezekiah and Isaiah fasted and prayed, and miraculously, the night that they fasted and prayed, the angel of the Lord caused confusion in the army of Sennacherib. They started killing each other, or perhaps the angel killed them. We don't know. Whatever happened, Sennacherib had to retreat. He never conquered Jerusalem. And we know from later royal inscriptions that he was assassinated by his own children. So here we have an inscription from Nineveh from 705 to 681 BCE. And this inscription is basically a city ordinance as to the building of a new highway or a new royal road in the city. It says the following: "Sennacherib, the great king, the mighty king, the king of the universe, the king of Assyria, the king of the four regions of the world, favored of the great gods, of the god Ashur and the goddess Ishtar, they have given me an invincible weapon and have opened my hand for the destruction of the enemies of Assyria. Trusting in their great might, I led my armies from one end of the earth to the other and brought in submission at my feet all princes dwelling in palaces of the four quarters of the world. And they assumed my yoke. At that time, I enlarged the site of Nineveh, my royal city. I made its market streets wide enough to run a royal road and made the road shine like the day. If ever any one of the people who dwell in that city tears down his old house and builds a new one, and the foundation of his house encroaches upon the royal road, they shall be hung upon a stake over his house." So it's basically saying, don't build your house over the royal road, otherwise you'll be punished by death. Obviously, this would be placed in a public place. This would be a decree that would be read out and placed in a main square where everybody could see. Again, also, alongside this collection, I haven't shared it here, but there's also reliefs from his palace where you can see that famous army that sieged Jerusalem. Now, this is an interesting item known as the Gezer calendar. Dates roughly from 930 BCE. Basically, to give you a ballpark date, is a few years after Solomon's death, King Solomon's death. What's interesting here is that you have 7 horizontal lines speaking of the months of the year and what you're supposed to do in each month. So there's a few theories about what this means. First, let's read it. It says 2 months late crops, 2 months sowing, 2 months spring crops, 1 month cutting flax, 1 month harvest of barley, 1 month all the harvest, 2 months fruit vines, 1 month summer fruits. And then you have an 8th vertical damage line which spells out Abi, which probably is the name Abiya or Abijah or Abiyahu. Most probably is the signature of the person who wrote this calendar. Now, what makes this calendar significant is that it's one of the oldest Hebrew scripts ever found, Paleo-Hebrew as we call it today. This is an ancestor of modern Hebrew. Actually, it's used, as you can see, it uses the Syro-Phoenician script before Hebrew used into the Aramean script that we know today. There's several theories as to what this tablet might be about. One theory claims that this was written by a farmer who had just learned to read and write, and perhaps this tablet was a way for this person to display his new writing skill. Another possible explanation is that this tablet was a writing exercise for children, or a way for children to learn about the agricultural cycle and the months of the year. You can maybe think of it as an ancient life sciences textbook or notebook of sorts. So we don't know for sure. But what makes it interesting again is that it's the earliest and best example of Paleo-Hebrew script. The calendar year begins at the end of the agricultural cycle, which is the traditional beginning of the year in ancient Israel. The location of discovery, I believe, is also quite important. This inscription is one of the at least half a dozen or so inscriptions that to me show that literacy was far more widespread in Israel, going beyond the elites and the scribal classes. The next inscription I'm going to show you is the Siloam Inscription, which was done by construction workers. But outside of those inscriptions, for example, you have the Lachish ostraca, which were written by soldiers, and you have several others as well. So it's interesting that this shows you that literacy was not just, amongst the elite or amongst the scribal classes, but there seems to be literacy in the countryside as well. So this suggests to me that written culture, a literate culture, was more widespread than we give it credit for. And perhaps this is a point in favor for an early date for the writing of the Pentateuch, or at least portions of the Old Testament, given that, for me, it'd be very surprising, given all this epigraphic evidence, that they would not have a written material for their own history. Because at the end of the day, what we see in the Pentateuch, yes, it's religious in nature, but it's also recording the history of the people. So it makes sense that something written existed prior to these finds, or prior to the period of these finds. The next inscription, as I said, is the Siloam Inscription, which was found in Jerusalem as part of Hezekiah's tunnel. You might know the story, but before Sennacherib raided the city or sieged the city, Hezekiah built a tunnel. This tunnel was supposed to bring the water from the Gihon spring, which lay outside of the city walls, and bring it to the inner walls, or the inner section of the city. This became later the pool of Siloam, or Siloam, which is where Jesus performed some of his miracles in the New Testament. There were two teams that were excavating on both sides, and they eventually met in the middle. And as they were getting close, they followed each other's voices, and finally they met in the middle, and in the place where they met, they placed this inscription. There's different theories as to why the route is not straight and resembles a zigzag. Some suggest that perhaps that was the only way to go. Maybe there were big rocks, and that's the only way of avoiding those big rocks. Other people suggest that perhaps there were tombs of kings within the city walls, and so the excavators didn't want to damage these tombs. So perhaps that's why they went zigzag all the way to where they met in the middle. This excerpt is from the inscription itself that was made by the construction workers. It says, "When the tunnel was driven through, and this was the way in which it was cut through, while were still axes, each man towards his fellow, and while there were still 3 cubits to be cut through, there was heard the voice of a man calling his fellow, for there was an overlap in the rock in the right. And when the tunnel was driven through, the quarrymen hewed the rock, each man towards his fellow, axe against axe, and the water flowed from the spring towards the reservoir for 1,200 cubits. And the height of the rock above the heads of the quarrymen was 100 cubits." So again, very interesting inscription made by construction workers in the tunnel. Again, showing me that literacy, which was much more widespread than we give it credit for. Another interesting find from this period, slightly earlier, 9th to the 8th century BC, from Samaria. This is the northern kingdom. The Samaria ostraca and the Lamelech handles, or to the king. Lamelech means for the king. These are royal handles. They have the royal seal as well. So what we have here is basically taxes that are being paid to the king in the form of olive oil and or wine. So these are the inscriptions that are found in the ostraca number 1, in the 10th year, to Samarayu from Bir Yam, a jar of old wine. Pega son of Elisha, 2. Uza son of so, 1. Eliba, 1. Bala son of Elisha, 1. Jedediah, 1. And you can read the rest of the ostracon on the screen. All are very interesting. And we also have the stamps. There's a collection of these, and the dates are roughly from the 8th century BC to about 587 BCE. So it's quite a big collection that is housed in the museum. These were found by George Reisner in 1910. And most of the ostraca have dates given according to the reign of an unnamed king. The dates are 9th, 10th, and 15th year of a king, but which king that is, it's a matter of guesswork. Rainey suggests that these ostraca should be viewed as scraps or notes which were taken before their content was transcribed into a lost papyrus ledger. If this is true, we can assume that due to climate conditions in the Levant, the pottery shards were able to outlive the official papyrus records. The most popular proposals for the unnamed king amongst the scholars seems to be Joash or Jeroboam II. Several of the inscriptions registered transfer of quality wine or fine oil from a certain place to a certain person. The topographical data they contain constitute the largest number of Israelite place names found outside of the biblical text. Some of these places are thought to be sites of royal vineyards close to the capital. The ostraca also provide us with some insight into ancient scribal practices. So what's the significance of these ostraca? Well, these discoveries help us create a more complete picture of the northern and southern kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Firstly, from these discoveries, it seems that the Israelite kingdom was more advanced economically in the 8th century BC compared to its southern neighbor. This we glean especially from the quality of luxury products that we see recorded in the ostraca. This data could suggest the wealth in the northern kingdom was centered in the capital, and most likely in the hands of a select few, while in the south, wealth tended to be more distributed and less centralized. This is according to Nam's thesis. If Nam's thesis is to be believed, we could postulate that in the northern kingdom, kings used redistributive gifting mechanisms as political capital to secure their power. If we are to read the pre-exilic minor prophets, we may postulate that in the north, injustice and corruption was centered in and around the capital Samaria, while the south, the problem of injustice and corruption, though present in Jerusalem, tended to primarily reside in rural Judah, especially in the treatment of farmers by land tenants. And there's several examples in Micah and Amos and other prophets, which I'm going to skip because of time constraints. But it just helps us gain a more complete picture of what was going on during that time period between the northern and southern kingdoms. Now, we've moved into a new period. This is the period of the exile. And here we have some reliefs from the Ishtar Gate. These were made by King Nebuchadnezzar, which we know from the story of Daniel. They date from the 6th century BCE. What we have here is a depiction of 3 different gods. The lion is Ishtar, the goddess of love and war. The Auroch is Haddad, the god of the storm, also known as Bel. And we also have Marduk. Marduk is this dragon god. This figure is also called Mushushu. It's a type of protective deity. It was one of the main gods of the city of Babylon. In fact, there was a temple dedicated solely to him. And we know of the construction of the Ishtar Gate and also the processional way, thanks to the Nebuchadnezzar Cylinder, which is also housed in the museum. These are to be found in the section of the ancient Near East, or the ancient Orient section. A lot of these figures were placed in the processional way as a way to intimidate people who would approach the city, but also as some sort of amulet of protection. For example, an inscription from a latter king named Nergalisar states, "I cast 7 bronze savage Mushushu," or these dragon depictions, "who spatter enemy and foe with deadly venom." Again, this image seems to have been placed in gates to repel any sorts of evil and curse. So it's a way of protecting the city. But it's very interesting that the biblical authors make a play of this, especially in Jeremiah chapter 50, verse 1 and 3. It says, the Lord spoke concerning Babylon and the land of Babylonia through the prophet Jeremiah. Announce the news among the nations, proclaim it, signal for people to pay attention, declare the news, do not hide it. Say, Babylon will be captured, Bel will be put to shame, Marduk will be dismayed, Babylon's idols will be put to shame. So here we have a mention of Marduk and Bel. Her disgusting images will be dismayed, for a nation from the north, which in this case is Persia, will attack Babylon, and it will lay her land waste. So these images would be part of the processional way. The processional way was important because it was used for New Year celebrations, or, for example, when the king returned from battles with booty and stuff. And the double gates, as you can see in the picture, one of which is located in the Berlin Museum. If you haven't had a chance to see it, I highly recommend it. This picture is from a website called kandingira.com. You might know, maybe Father Ilya knows already, there's a Byzantium1200.com website where a lot of these sites of ancient Constantinople are rebuilt in 3D. It's from the same maker. He has pictures and a 3D remodeled ancient city of Babylon. So it's quite a good resource if you just want to look through what Babylon might have looked like in antiquity, or even use it for your own purposes if you're teaching classes, so on and so forth. Now here we have a statue of a Lamassu from the 8th century BCE. The word Lamassu means protective spirit in Assyrian. And what makes this piece interesting is that it roughly provides us a visual for the type of thing that Ezekiel might have seen in his visions of the cherubim. So one of the problems we have in modern day is that when we think of the word cherubim, we think of, baby-faced angels, flapping their wings or something like that. And nothing could be further from the truth. The Lamassu or the Shedu were these composite creatures where, they had this body of a lion, they had the hooves of an ox, they had the wings of an eagle, and they had the face of a man. So this is much more alike to what Ezekiel would have seen, for example, in his vision. In ancient Assyria and Babylon, the Lamassu or Shedu were household protective spirits of the common people, becoming associated later as royal protectors, and were placed as sentinels at entrances. Common placements of these statues was at tombs, city gates, palaces, and royal thrones. One of the reasons why the figure of the Lamassu was used so extensively by royalty was to instill a sense of fear, reverence, and awe in the visitors. These figures were in essence a reflection of the grandeur of the kingdom, and particularly of the king. These works of art conveyed several metaphorical messages, which in turn served as a reflection of the king's power and splendor. Especially in ancient cultures, these animals would be associated with different things. For example, the ox would be associated with strength. The face of a man would be associated with wisdom. The lion body would be associated with royalty. The wings of the eagle would be associated with peace and protection. So it was a way of reflecting the qualities of the king, so to speak. So it is of my opinion that the cherubim, aside from being these heavenly creatures that enthrone, that surround the throne of God, are also a reflection of his qualities, of his glories, of the fact that he's omnipresent, that he is omnipotent, and so on and so forth. So we see in Ezekiel again these figures surrounding the throne of God. Another interesting stela from this period is from Nabonidus. Nabonidus was the father of Belshazzar, whom we know from the mention of the book of Daniel. He was the last king to be killed when the Persians overthrew him. Here's an introduction of Nabonidus' stela. I'm not going to read it again because of constraints of time, but Nabonidus was a controversial figure. He was not of royal background. Instead, he was of aristocratic and military background. His father was governor of Haran. His mother was a devotee of the moon god Sin. Nabonidus turned his back to the main deity of Babylon, Marduk, and instead focused his attention on the moon god Sin, the god of his native city of Haran. In 553, Nabonidus left for a military campaign and did not return to Babylon for 10 years. So If he's not in Babylon for 10 years, then who is ruling in Babylon in his place? Well, his son, Belshazzar, his co-regent. Some scholars suggest that the biblical text is problematic as regarding Belshazzar, because it states that Belshazzar was the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but the problem is readily resolved as the term son in the biblical language is quite flexible. Jeremiah 27 provides clarity when stating that it's his son's sons or his grandson. So in ancient Near Eastern custom for Belshazzar, he was considered the son or the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. It would be enough for Nabonidus to have married one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters. And this is precisely the case, as Nabonidus married the daughter of Nebuchadnezzar's second wife, Nitocris. So again, interesting find. And the relationship of Nabonidus and Belshazzar also explains why Daniel was offered to be the third highest ruler of the kingdom in Daniel 5, verse 7. Nabonidus being number 1, Belshazzar, his co-regent, ruling in the city of Babylon, being number 2, Daniel then being number 3. Now, here's an interesting collection. I really like this collection. This is a Sumerian Proverbs book, or a collection of Sumerian Proverbs dating from the 19th century BCE, found in Nippur. And I want to read some of these for you. It says, if bread is left over, 1.9, the mongoose eats it. If I have bread left over, a stranger consumes it. 111, you don't speak of that which you have found, you speak of that which you have lost. 114, don't talk about what hurts you. 115, kind of fatalistic. Wealth is far away, poverty is near. 118, again, very fatalistic. Wealth, like migratory birds, never finds a place to settle. 128, when a purchase is settled, it is soon out of mind. 152, there's no baked cake in the middle of the dough. In the city of no dog, the fox is the overseer. In the city of the lame, the halt are couriers. What else? Oh, 182. What has been spoken in secret will be revealed in the woman's quarters. Not a very high view of woman here. What else? 191. My girlfriend's heart is a heart made for me. 146. Marry a wife according to your choice. Have children to your heart's desire. Well, 154. A thriftless wife living in a house is worse than all diseases. Again, seems like these people had a lot of problems with their wives, women special, and also money. A disorderly son, his mother should not have given birth to him. His God should not have created him. 159, an unfaithful penis matches an unfaithful vulva. 160, marrying is human, greeting children is divine. Now, it's interesting. there are some similarities with biblical wisdom literature, particularly with the Book of Proverbs here, although there's a lot of differences as well. Ancient Proverbs reflect the worldview and the way of thinking of ancient societies. And this collection is interesting in the way that it somewhat reflects a fatalistic attitude to life. You know, enjoyment of life is outweighed by laments and complaints that one is powerless to change certain fixed things. Fate is inescapable. It's more important to consume than to share. Poverty is hard to break out from. Wealth is constantly fleeting. The lamentation of a slave has no end. There's a negative view of the opposite sex. One should be careful what he shares with a woman. Women are generally viewed as objects meant to fulfill men's desires. Having a wife can mean risky business. Life is meant to bring you satisfaction and meaning through having children, marrying well, and self-sufficiency. So this kind of reflects the worldview that these people had, these Sumerians had. Now, contrast this with the Proverbs in the Bible. Life itself is not viewed as fatalistic chain of events in which we have no choice or say. The Book of Proverbs is structured as a set of instructions from a father to his son. If the son chooses wisdom and the fear of the Lord, he will live a successful and peaceful life. If the son chooses the way of folly and evil, the diametric opposite of wisdom, he will experience ruin and shame. Note the aspect of choice. The fate of the child lies in his own hands. Unlike Mesopotamian thought, he is capable of changing his destiny. This approach is very reminiscent of God's words to Israel in Deuteronomy 30. I Here I give you two ways, one that leads to life and one that leads to death. Choose my way so that it leads to life. Another important distinction is found in the portrayal of the feminine figure. While in the Sumerian Proverbs, women tend to be viewed as a way to satisfy men's desires or merely obstacles towards the goal, the biblical Proverbs portray wisdom as the voice of a woman. Wisdom is a guide, a companion. She's associated with creativity, prudence, discipline, discretion, strategy, good sense, and competence. There's 4 poems of the Lady Wisdom that can be found in Proverbs. This is not to say that there's no negative imagery. There's also the image of the harlot as well. But of chief importance is that whether used in negative or positive examples, women are viewed as companions, guides, or aids, rather than a way of fulfilling man's self-centered desires. So we have a very, very opposite view as towards life, the opposite sex, etc., etc. So I find this very, very fascinating, very interesting. Here's another interesting wisdom inscription or poetry, we could call. It's the oldest love poem. It's called the Poem of Susheen. It was unearthed in Nippur. It dates from roughly 2000 BCE. To me, this is one of the hidden jewels of the museum. Some of these lines sound very reminiscent of the Song of Songs. For example, in the Song of Songs, chapter 4, verse 11, it says, "Your lips, my bride, drip honey. Honey and milk are under your tongue, and the fragrance of your garments is like the fragrance of Lebanon." So we see a lot of honeydew imagery, both in the Song of Songs and also in this love poem. So what is this Sumerian poem all about? Let me explain it briefly. Susheen was the king of the city-state of Ur and reigned during the 20th or 21st century BCE. At the beginning of every calendar year, the king of the city of Ur would enter a sexual union with the high priestess of Inanna, the goddess of love and fertility. What the sexual union was meant to achieve was blessing and prosperity for the forthcoming year. As part of the sexual rite, a poem would be written down and be read in banquets of the New Year festivities. Even though the poem was certainly about the physical act of the sexual union, it was also reflective of the covenant or contractual relationship entered between the king and Inanna. As far as who the king represented in this ritual is a matter of debate. One explanation is that the king simply represented the people. Another possible explanation is that the king represented Dumuzi, Inanna's shepherd's lover, who was deified as a result of his sexual union with her. It is possible, therefore, that the religious rite was a reenactment of the Inanna and Dumuzi myth. Some scholars would like to argue for the dependence of the Song of Songs to poetry like this, but due to the 1,000-year gap, it seems very unlikely. What we could, however, conclude is that the Song of Songs follows a type of poetry that was popular. So kind of like how maybe we read Shakespeare's poetry nowadays. Maybe this was an ancient type of love poem that during the time of Solomon, it was popular, and so Solomon or the author decided to write it in this style. And what we have in the Song of Songs is also a love poem, an erotic poem, so to speak, but it's reflective of, again, the covenant relationship of God and his people as personified in the king and the lover and the beloved, so to speak. So is it a poem about it? Is the Song of Songs, how are we to read it? Is it a poem of a sexual encounter? Is it a celebration of sexuality? Is it a symbolic love relationship between Yahweh and his people? My suggestion is that perhaps it's all of the above. It's both a love poem about the beauty of sex, but also perhaps it has undertones. At least that's how a lot of the rabbis used to read it in ancient times. Connotations of the covenant love relationship between God and his people, kind of like we have in this oldest love poem here. Plague Prayer of Mursilis II. This is a Hittite king from the 13th century BCE. The reason I included this is because of the interesting days that we're undergoing right now with the coronavirus, the pandemic or the plague, so to speak. Well, during the reign of Mursilius II, he had a plague that had been lasting for 20 years. People were dying. He was desperate. He was offering libations and offerings to numerous gods. It says, when I celebrated festivals, I worshipped all the gods. I never preferred to one temple from the other to the other. He's giving this to his storm god, but he doesn't know if the storm god is the cause of this plague. So he's basically saying, I've never preferred one over the other. The situation is getting kind of critical because the priests who are offering the libations and the offerings, they're also dying. So he doesn't know what's going to happen. And he also doesn't know the reason as to why this plague is happening in his reign. Although he does have a theory. And the theory is that Mursilius' dad entered an agreement with the Egyptians, or he had entered a conflict with the Egyptians, and the conflict had been settled under an oath given to the storm god. Well, it turns out that Mursilius' father, Supilulima, had not honored this oath, and he attacked the Egyptian territory of Amka. And when he brought back prisoners, the plague started spreading. So it's possible that the plague had spread from the prisoners themselves. And this is why perhaps the land of Hatti, or the land of the Hittites, was infested for these 20 years. What we have here in this prayer is an example of a principle of divine retribution. Man has sinned against the gods and deserves punishment. The nature of a sin, however, varies. It may be that the correct offerings weren't made, or that an oath wasn't honored, and therefore a specific god was insulted or offended. The plague and punishment was then viewed as the retribution of the offended god. In a polytheistic culture, figuring out which god was offended was often quite an ordeal, like is the case in Mursilius' story. Now, in the biblical worldview, one observes that sin is explained in different terms. Sin is explained as a covenant breach or covenant unfaithfulness. Hosea 6 explains, "For I desire mercy, not sacrifice, and acknowledgement of God rather than burnt offerings. As at Adam, they have broken the covenant. They were unfaithful to me there." Adam's sin was one of rebellion and disobedience. He saw that the fruit could make him as God, and he chose to eat it and become his own God. This act of hubris brought disaster not only to himself, but to all creation. Are plagues God's punishment? Are they a result of humanity's mismanagement of earth and the result of playing to be God? Well, I don't know. For the biblical writer, the answers to these questions are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We should sway away from an image of a vindictive God. Vindictiveness is what we see in the Hittite gods when their particular desires are not fulfilled. This is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible is just. He doesn't change. He sets covenants and boundaries, but humans may violate these in their responses, and different responses may have, therefore, different consequences. Mursilius' prayer also bears some resemblance to the story of David's plague found in 2 Samuel 24 and 1 Chronicle 21, although one must say that it completely lacks the redemptive arch found in the biblical story. We're moving on to the New Testament. This is the last section. Thank you for bearing with me. I know it's been kind of long, but there was a lot of ground to cover. And we're going to do a couple of objects from the New Testament period. The first of these is the Tanatos inscription, or the death inscription from Herod's temple in Jerusalem, dating from the 1st century. Here we have a warning. It says, "No foreigner is allowed to enter the courtyard and enclosure surrounding the temple. Whoever is caught will be responsible to himself for his death, which will ensue." So what is this inscription about? Well, here you have a model of Herod's temple. The outer courtyards, which you see in orange, were the court of the Gentiles, so everybody could enter those courts. But the inner courts were reserved for the Jews. There were two courts, inner courts. One was the court of the women, and one was the court of Israel. And if you're a Gentile, you cannot enter these inner courts. And just to make sure that you don't enter it, there's this warning sign that would be put up, which basically says if you cross over, then you will be killed. Now, there's a couple of allusions to this in the New Testament. The first is in Acts chapter 21, 27 through 29. If you recall, Paul, when he was visiting Jerusalem, brought with him a friend from Ephesus named Trophimus. And the Jews accused Paul of taking Trophimus into the inner courtyard, and that's why they want to kill him. That's in Acts 21. Another allusion is probably made by Paul himself in Ephesians chapter 2, where he speaks of the wall of hostility. For he himself is our peace, who has made the two groups one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility, that is between Jew and Gentile. His purpose was to create in himself one new humanity out of the two, thus making peace, and in one body to reconcile both of them to God through the cross, by which he put to death their hostility. So again, we have this allusion or imagery of the dividing wall and the warning sign that has been destroyed in the body of Christ. Two interesting busts, one of Augustus and one of Tiberius. Augustus, as you know, was the emperor during Jesus' birth. Tiberius was the emperor during Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection. Augustus's bust is from Pergamum. Tiberius's is from Constantinople. They're both dated to the 1st century, but we don't know where the Tiberius one came from. I mean, it was found in Constantinople in the 2nd or 3rd century. Most probably was brought from somewhere else. What makes the figures of the emperors interesting is that a lot of people miss this, but in the 1st century, many of the titles used by Jesus, like Lord and Son of God, was also used of the emperors. And even the word gospel, evangelion, or good news, was used in the context of emperor worship. You know, it was a good news when a new emperor came to the throne, or when the emperor won a battle and he returned to the city with the spoils of war. Messengers would give this good news ahead of time so that the people could meet him at the gates, for example. So again, this context helps us understand why the early Jesus movement was so viewed as such a threat to the Roman authorities. For example, in Acts 17, we have this quote, "These people who have stirred up trouble through the world have come here too, and Jason has welcomed them as guests. They're all acting against Caesar's decrees, saying there's another king named Jesus." Now, why would they have said that? Well, because of a lot of the titles that the Christians were using was used for the emperor worship as well, or the context of the emperor as well. There's a inscription that was found in Turkey, in Priene, if I'm not mistaken, that actually speaks of Augustus. The people in Asia decided that the New Year celebrations should begin on the 23rd of September, which is the birthday of Augustus. And it says that, it's very interesting because a lot of the words, they will sound familiar to you, and they're used in the context of the emperor. It says, "Since the providence that has divinely ordered our existence has applied her energy and zeal, and has brought to life the most perfect good in Augustus, whom she filled with virtues for the benefit of mankind, bestowing him upon us and our descendants as a savior," so you see the word savior used there, "he would put an end to war and will order peace." So again, the Caesars to put end to all wars and to bring world peace. Caesar, who by his epiphany, another word that the Christians used, exceeded the hopes of those who prophesied good tidings, or evangelion, or good news, not only outdoing benefactors of the past, but also allowing no hope of greater benefactions in the future. And since the birthday of the God first brought to the world the good tidings residing in him, so again, evangelion used there, for that reason, with good fortune and safety, the Greeks of Asia have decided that the new year in all the cities should begin in the 23rd of September. So again, here we have one of the reasons why the usage of these vocabulary was so polemic and caused a lot of distress amongst the Romans and the pagans, and a lot of persecution as well. This is the last item. You made it all the way, yay! This is a altar to a nameless god from Palmyra, dating from the 2nd to 3rd century CE. In fact, there's 3 of these, 3 limestone incense altars from Palmyra. They contain various dedications to the nameless God. In the Palmyrean script, one of the altars is dedicated by Ogilu, son of Haire. Another is by Magda, son of Vahbalat. Many such altars have been found in Palmyra. They generally contain a blessing such as, "Blessed be his name forever," and a phrase of thanksgiving for an answered prayer or request. This nameless God had no known sanctuary or temple and appears to be a God who listens to personal petitions. These altars seem to suggest a private spirituality or relationship between the petitioner and the deity. But why is this God nameless? Is it because perhaps they were God-fearers, as we see in the New Testament? Or is it perhaps because they didn't know what God gave them that blessing? I don't know. But you'll probably have identified the parallelism here with Paul's speech in Athens, in the Areopagus, where he says, "Men of Athens, I see that you're very religious and you have several altars dedicated to nameless gods. Well, let me tell you who this nameless God is." And he uses it as a preaching point, so to speak, to give his message in Athens. So just to conclude, as some of you already know, maybe some of you don't, I've been writing about these for a while now. I gave a break during the month of March, and I haven't started to write again. Coronavirus really altered our schedules. We had to do homeschool with the kids for several months, and then summer holidays and whatnot, but I want to get back to writing. But eventually what I want to do is I want to publish these in a book. And what else will be included in the book? Some of these I've already written. Some of them are still pending. But these are some of the extra items that you might see in a future published book, all of them very interesting. And again, the purpose is to not just talk of the items themselves, but to provide context and to understand the biblical text. So yeah, that's all I have to share, Father Ilya. And if there's any questions, then I'm more than happy.
Well, first of all, thank you for absolutely fantastic presentation. For me, it was like a living being with you once again at the museum. And, some extra details obviously came into your presentation. Maybe some of our guests have questions, so they can unmute themselves and certainly ask if they have anything to ask. No? Crowd is not huge. I have sort of a question not particularly related to your presentation. Istanbul Museum Archaeological Collection, at least part of it was closed and open, then closed again. Was museum reopened, or it's still sort of under the restoration, quote unquote?
Well, I haven't been in months, so I don't really know. But the last I knew, they had closed the top floor again because of some minor earthquake that happened, and they freaked out, and so they closed the third floor where the objects from Syria and Palestine are being displayed. So I'm not sure if that section is open, but the Museum of the Ancient Orient, the tile kiosk, is open, and at least the ground floor of the main museum building is open. So
that's where we visited. I think Lynn may have a question.
I have a question. Thank you. You mentioned early on the Samaria Astra, looked like those with handles, something where there were inscriptions with clay.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I've never heard that term before. Ostrakon. Ostrakon. Okay.
Yeah, they're basically broken pieces of pottery.
Shards.
People would write, shards. Basically, people would write on them because of practicality and ease. Papyrus paper was expensive and it was not readily available. So if you wanted to jot down notes, you just used like a shard of pottery, and that's where you jotted your notes. Perhaps then later they were transcribed to a papyrus. We don't know.
So it was something that wasn't something that was inscribed while the clay was wet. It was something that was scratched in later on, just whatever pieces have to be down. Okay.
Exactly. Either scratched or littered or written on the pottery itself. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. More than welcome.
All right. Well, it seems like most of our guests have resigned at this point. So I guess, but no, I thank you for presentation. I'm thinking it's one of the best. I know of several people who are not able to attend, but who are very eager to listen to you. So I'll make this recording available for sure on YouTube right away, and maybe on Facebook page as well. And I hope to see you again with your permission, because I'm thinking what you're doing is incredibly important. And I'm sure that after listening to your presentation, even more people are going to come. And I most appreciative for your time and for your effort. I always amazed at the amount of knowledge that you have, and the eloquence with which you presented. No, honest. You know, it's a gift. It's a gift to know, but it's even greater gift to be able to put it in the right words.
Yeah.
And what?
Again, I wanna apologize if some of this was a little maybe too technical, or perhaps a little over the heads, but
no, it's good. It's good to know. And Lynn is my witness. Lynn was part of the group last fall when we had a pleasure, to have you as a guide through the museum.
Yeah. It's always different to guide it in person than it is to see it on a PowerPoint presentation. So much more fun to see it in person, definitely.
Absolutely. Well, Lord willing, before too long we'll reconnect. Well, I thank you, Mark, very much for being with us. I thank you all the guests who came, and until we meet again, which hopefully sooner than later. Every Saturday, at least I'm planning till Christmas season, perhaps, to have various presentation. One of our guests on October 17, actually it was confirmed, will be Mark Fairchild.
Great.
Our mutual friend, who will be talking about the first apostolic journey of Apostle Paul through Asia Minor, so-called lost years of Paul. But there are going to be many more presentations as well. So, Mark, thank you so much. I'm very much your debtor, and I'll see you again soon.
All right. Bye-bye.